Welcome to the Liberty Lobbyist. Cooper Davis, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Melissa, for having me.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know about you, tell us a little bit about your background. And you are the executive director of Inner Compass Initiative. Tell us about your organization.
Well, Intercompass Initiative, we're a 501c3 registered nonprofit. We've been around for about 10 years. And what we do is we help people, we help individuals, families, and even practitioners make more informed choices around psychiatric drugs, diagnoses, and of particular note, and maybe we could talk more about this, is tapering and withdrawal from those drugs.
Mhm. Okay, fantastic. So I found out about you from an article that you co-authored in the Brownstone titled "Beware Universal Mental Health Screening."
Mhm.
Now, you don't know a lot about me, but I am a registered lobbyist in the state of New Hampshire, but I am the executive director of 501c4, and we do I'm sort of a grassroots lobbyist. So I have no financial
Mhm.
interest behind me. One of our main issues are parental choice and consent issues. And we have kind of gotten involved in this idea of school-based health clinics. We're the last state in
Mhm.
the country to get school-based health clinics. And I see a lot of alarm bells. So when I read this article, I could kind of connected the two in my mind a bit. But let's go back to the article and the issue that you were specifically talking about in Illinois. What is the new policy in Illinois?
Sure. So in Illinois, Governor Pritzker has brought about something that, well, it's literally a program for universal mental health screening for K through 12. I do not have my this particular policy. I'm not the one to talk you through the ins and outs of it, but the piece that I co-authored for Brownstone was meant to sort of, yeah, in the title of the piece, it was beware. There's an assumption that screenings, um, you know, what's the harm, right?
Right.
We understand that in this country we have a mental health crisis and that it's hitting children especially hard. So what is the harm in just checking in? Are the kids okay?
Mhm.
And the answer to that question is actually there's quite a lot of harm. Um, First of all, these screenings themselves, um, they're not hyper scientific or objective, let's just say. Some of them are self assessments for older kids, they might fill out themselves. Otherwise, these are being administered by teachers, even parents, maybe a guidance counselor. Um, they are asking questions, usually something like 35 questions, something like that, depending on which one you're giving. And the answers you can choose always, sometimes, or never. And the questions will be something like, I am having a harder time paying attention in class than I have in the past, right? I
Mhm.
am feeling more sad than I, was a few weeks ago. Um, Stuff that is really, really hard, genuinely, depending on what day you're being asked these questions,
Right.
for any of us, it's a kind of a crapshoot. Um, Always, sometimes, or never. Also, when you're dealing with, younger kids, the idea of always or never, those sort of like absolute terms, even,
Right.
especially teenagers can get a little hyperbolic
And I have a
with the always
7-year-old,
and
like, I don't
nevers.
think she could understand that.
Yeah, and on one level, again, what's the harm? It's good to check in, and for a lot of kids, they don't even have an adult at home who's checking in, right? It's important in a lot of ways to make sure that kids have opportunities to just check in with somebody on how they're doing. The issue with these screenings is so let's just say that you fill this thing out and you score. Every district might have a different way of going about it. But say if it's a 35 question, screening, and you have always, you would assign 2 points, sometimes would be 1 point, never 0 points. So you're either, doing 1 or 2 points per question out of 35. If you score 28 or higher, generally speaking, you're probably going to get recommended for follow-up of some kind. And that is then going to be somebody, probably maybe not a clinician, but somebody with a little bit more of a position of authority within mental health professions, let's just say.
Yeah.
And so you know if you get the screening on maybe a bad day, but then that follow-up for the child might become significant. Oh, I scored differently than little Susie, my friend, so there's something up with me. I'm not quite sure what that's about, but I have to come out of class to go visit with this person.
Mm-hmm.
So now the kid is, thinking of themselves as like maybe they have something going on. And as kids can do, sometimes they play into that, sometimes they do the opposite. It's difficult to know which way that's going to go. And then, of course, depending on the nature of the problem, you may have a kid who has a lot going on at home for some very, very specific reason that has a very specific remedy that exists within the context of their home life. Their dog just died, whatever, right? In an instance like that, the mental health system is not going to necessarily offer them a whole lot, right? They're not going to bring the dog back to life. If it's an issue of being able to cope, then sure, it would be great to have that extra support. But I think the general idea that my co-author and I were trying to get across in this piece was that, thinking of this as, if this is universal, this is happening every single year, K through 12, that is, at least 12, 13, 14 opportunities, if you're doing it just once a year, to, kind of move a little bit closer to this system that I think we can all agree, it's sort of not controversial to say, whatever's going on with our mental health crisis in this country, we have more people on the receiving end of mental health treatment than ever before in history.
Yes. So let's talk about that. I think we can sit back and say, well, yeah, there probably is some type of mental health crisis specifically amongst children, but in the general population. And I hear more and more in everyday vernacular than I ever have before about taking care of your mental health, mental health, mental health. It's a constant thing that people are talking about, almost to the point of dwelling. And yet, with all of this access to service in a way that frankly we've never had before, it seems to be getting worse. So is it getting worse, number one? And is potentially the treatment part of the issue?
I mean, these are big questions, and far be it from me to be able to answer them definitively. But I think they're important questions that more and more people are asking. The reality is, we have a mental health system that, for a variety of reasons, tends to have a preference for a very medicalized view of mental health.
Mhm.
That
You
is a
mean like
problem.
drugs, like pharmaceutical drugs and that sort of thing?
Pharmaceutical drugs, but it also even extends to sort of the diagnostic framework that we're using. So, you look at, there's a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, which is what clinicians in this country, psychiatrists in particular, are using to sort of identify how to approach treatment. Okay. And so those are, you have diagnostic criteria. If you meet 5 out of the 7, then you can be diagnosed with major depression, generalized anxiety, ADHD, whatever it is. So that even that diagnosis itself is, on some level, somewhat of a medicalized idea. Again, like, think about, the dog just died. You may have in the weeks or even months following the death of this beloved family pet, you may meet the diagnostic criteria. What a lot of parents don't necessarily understand is that meeting that diagnostic criteria does not mean that you have a thing called depression. It just means that you meet the criteria for a thing called depression.
Mm.
And that diagnosis ultimately is supposed to be sort of like a tool to pragmatically guide treatment, which can and often does include drugs. But even the diagnosis itself is increasingly misunderstood to be referring to a disease like with heart disease, with a neurological issue. That's a type of disease that is a little bit different than what you have in the DSM.
Mhm.
And even some of the language that gets used, especially like mental health awareness campaigns, will say these are diseases no different than physical diseases. Taking a psychiatric drug for a psychiatric condition is no different than taking insulin for diabetes. It's actually very, very different. You cannot equate. Uh, we could go through a list of the reasons why it's impossible to equate mental disorders as conceived in the DSM with a physiological condition which you can test for, like
Right.
diabetes.
Mhm.
And so I think part of there's two prongs that the work that I do and that we do at our nonprofit is like really interested in helping families get a better sense for. One is this idea of medicalization, and where does that actually show up in people's lives, and how can you identify it when it's happening? Sometimes it's because school districts don't have the resources to approach any other problem, right? There's one thing that we do know how to do, and we know how to do it quite efficiently, which is get especially older kids, teenagers, to get them a psychiatric diagnosis and get them onto drug treatment. It costs a lot more money to dive deep on what that kid has going on, develop the trusting relationship that's necessary in the context of something like talk therapy. And then it's also just generally the case that even talk therapy is not mental health treatment is never a replacement for the basic things that kids need,
Mhm.
right? So
Right.
this is the other thing that our nonprofit is really focused on is, nowadays, oftentimes parents will hear, oh, my kid's having trouble in school, better make an appointment with a doctor. That's their first thought. But that's a very new phenomenon. And there's about 18 different things that are worthy of considering before you get to making a doctor's appointment. Let's talk about sleep. Let's talk about diet. Let's talk about movement. Like, forget exercise. How much movement is my
Right.
kid getting? Let's talk about screen time. All this stuff. And a lot of people roll their eyes at this and they'll say, no, we're talking about serious disorders here. You're not going to, mindfulness your way out of it. But the reality is, I know for myself, when I am eating right, when I'm getting enough sleep, uh, when I'm moving my body at least a little bit every day and not staring at screens, the difference between how I am when I'm doing the bare minimum on that stuff versus when I'm disregarding it completely is huge. I'm like a different person.
Yeah.
It's even more so for our kids who are developing.
Mhm. Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree. Um, Obviously, this is Illinois' new policy. I like for people to be made aware. I mean, once one state starts, other states start considering it. And I will tell you, this is a bipartisan thing. This has nothing to do with whether,
Yeah.
well, maybe you're in a blue state or a red state. I hear politicians every day on both sides of the aisle at the state level talking about the mental health crisis amongst children, and their knee-jerk reaction, as is most politicians' knee-jerk reaction, is to throw money at it. They just want to throw money at it, and they don't even care about like where it's going, what it's being used for. Just, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. I have noticed, we talked a little bit about this before I got on, but yeah, we have school-based health clinics coming here. They're always mental health focused, and
Mhm.
I am concerned about schools becoming medicalized.
Mhm.
Um, do you see an inherent issue in the way that I do, as far as, are schools the proper place for medical care, even mental health care?
Mhm.
My argument has always been, well, why aren't we sending some of these grant monies to mental health hospitals? That system is completely strained. Why are
Mhm.
we so focused in on the schools? And I
Mhm.
see that as a push in most states that they're looking to insert into the schools. Why do you think that is?
My personal feeling on this is that by the time an issue is showing up as a diagnosable mental health condition, you're already quite a bit too far down the sort of like chain of cause and effect. A lot of the stuff that shows up on the individual level as a mental disorder, we're talking about things that start off as social problems, economic and financial issues, um, it, certainly areas that deal with community violence and criminality in significant ways. Uh, Not to mention sort of the lifestyle stuff we're talking about earlier. All of this stuff, if we're handing out money towards things, I think that there's not just some worthy targets in these issues that exist a bit upstream from a lot of this stuff. The thing that worries me the most about mental health care in general right now, we have more mental health care happening than ever before, and yet our rates of suffering and diagnosable disorder are higher than ever. And that's a
Mhm.
complicated problem, but I think that it's worthy of maybe stopping to consider if what can we do to actually get people um, at sort of at the root of the problem. People roll their eyes at root cause thinking, but the reality is here is where it's most important. When you are starting to turn schools into mental health centers, here's my biggest issue with that. Schools are supposed to be, in my view, two things. It's a place to learn, okay? And it's a place outside of the home where you can feel safe. Those are the two things that are supposed to happen. Now, if you are increasingly using schools for all these other things, and there's a lot of interest in this, and it's increased a great deal. I have young kids in school where I live in Connecticut. If the number one predictor for health of all the factors that a school might be able to control is going to be literacy, and that includes mental health. If you cannot read well, okay, you're not going to have an easy go of it. And the more we're trying to do all this other stuff in the school, that I view that as somewhat zero sum. Schools can only be so many things. There are only so many hours in the day. There are only so many people working in those schools, and the kids only have so much uh, willingness to absorb what supports are being offered there. So to me, it's a big concern. It should be a bipartisan concern. I think it's really ridiculous when people try to break this down to something like, no, we need more services, we need more supports, we need more of all of this, and that's what people on the left think, and people on the right just want to take everything away. It's so much more complicated than that, and it really is about where are we placing our sense of priority. And then also, when it comes to mental health, I think we also do our teachers a great disservice when we professionalize help, right? So teachers become disempowered. Ideally, a teacher is somebody who is gifted and loves children and is gifted in teaching children and nurturing the child and has natural sense of insight into what that child might need on a given day. When you tell that teacher, no, at some point you have to stop that and let a professional come in, a specialist, and focus, strictly within the realm of sort of this like mental health
Yeah.
care paradigm, that disempowers the teacher in ways that I think are really significant. And I've seen it happen with my own children where, teachers have had to say, look, I understand your son. I understand what he needs. I am doing my best to give it to him, but it is the policies of the district that da 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 da. And the administration will say the same thing. And the superintendent will have their own version of it. And it kind of just goes all the way up to the point where nobody seems to be responsible, except, of course, like the school board where everybody's yelling at each other all the time.
This reminds me, I have a very good friend, and she's always been talking about mission creep in
Yeah.
schools. And at first I was like, what are you talking about? But that it right, I mean, at its foundation, it was supposed to be about making children, do reading, writing, and arithmetic. And
Hmm.
I could not agree with you more. You say there is only so many hours in the day. There is only so much bandwidth for a teacher. So now you're adding all these other factors that take away from their ability to simply teach your child to read, write. And yes, and there is a lot of value to that, and it makes you happier. If
Hmm.
you can be academically successful and therefore successful in life. I know this is a little bit of kind of going into your organization. I can't help my cynical brain cannot help but feel that while there might be surface, altruistic motivation to this, that ultimately it does start feeding children into the medical rat wheel system,
Hmm.
which is a very profitable system. So,
Hmm.
can you go into a little bit of that? What are some of the inherent issues of starting down that path,
Hmm.
and how could people get out of it?
Hmm. Sure. Well, there's a couple things that I just think most people should understand when it comes to specifically drug treatment
Yeah.
for mental health conditions. First of all, and it might be a little surprising to some folks, but this is um, these facts have been checked. So, for one thing, there is no psychiatric drug, including all the commonly prescribed ones, that is tested and studied and or even approved for more than 6 to 8 weeks of use prior to approval. Let me restate that to get it exactly right.
Okay.
All the stuff, so all the SSRIs, the stimulants, the anxiety drugs, all of this stuff. Okay, pre-approval, the FDA is approving these as treatments for these various conditions on the basis of 6 to 8 week long trials. That is what, based on that, the FDA is saying, okay, these are good to go.
Yeah.
It is then up to the discretion of the physician, you know, how they want to prescribe these drugs. There is zero evidence base supporting the type of long-term use that we all know is happening most of the time. People are not on these drugs for a few months. Sometimes they are, and that's one thing. But a lot of times when we're talking about psychiatric drug use in the United States, CDC's own numbers a couple years ago is something, I believe it's like 64 million Americans is taking at least one psychiatric drug.
Wow.
It's 1 in 12 kids, and I think it's 1 in 3 teenagers is currently taking at least one psychiatric drug. These are huge, huge numbers. The vast majority will take them for far longer than 6 to 8 weeks. Another thing that is not studied basically ever is polypharmacy, which is the term that we use to describe more than one drug at a time. So most people, you know, I won't say most people, but it's quite common. Most people that I know taking a psych drug, and I know when I took psych drugs, I was most of the time on more than one. These drugs are never studied in conjunction with one another. Okay. There's no evidence base in favor of the safety or the efficacy of that.
Wow.
And yet it's become sort of standard practice. Part of the reason that it's become standard practice, we can put aside, like, it's easy to say big bad pharma doing big bad stuff, and I won't deny that that may be the case, right? But there's a lot more going on here. Most psych drugs, for example, are generic.
Generic. Yeah.
Pharma's not making, fistfuls of dollars on these, but a lot of people are. There's insurance companies, there's pharmacy benefit managers. There are people in the mental health system itself who have various quotas and need to demonstrate that they, have done something. There's the doctor in private practice who's sitting there with a patient who's suffering, and that patient is saying, "Doctor, please do something." What else can they do? everybody has a different type of incentive in this system. And I think part of the issue is not those incentives per se, but part of it is just become so normalized not to question, the possibility that there's some danger in what we're doing because it's so widespread. One of the ways that it gets, some of the harms maybe are going under observed. It's my personal feeling that the benefits maybe have been overstated and that the harms are under acknowledged. One way that really matters, and I try to not kind of geek out too much around this, but when you are dependent on a drug, and depending on the drug, it doesn't take that long to become physiologically dependent on it, right? Your body and your brain become accustomed to the presence of that molecule, and it will change to accommodate the presence of that molecule. It's just like any drug. We know in addiction, you gain a tolerance to a drug. Every single drug has tolerance effects, including prescribed ones. So when you've been taking one of these for the long term, every single day, of course, the body adapts for the presence of that. When you take that away, the body goes through some type of a withdrawal, right? And if the drug is, say, an antidepressant, when you take that drug away, that withdrawal syndrome is going to look like the inverse of its effect. So it'll look like depression. With an anxiety drug, withdrawal effects are going to look like anxiety, and so on and so forth. So a lot of times what happens is people are on these drugs, they go on for whatever reason, they take them for a while, they say, you know what, I think I'd like to try coming off of this. Because they are coming off for the most part too rapidly, and they're not educated, and even prescribers are not properly educated on the withdrawal symptoms, or what they call the difference between withdrawal and relapse, right? They will identify a relapse of the original condition. Oh, there's your depression. Let's get you back on that drug, right? Versus if they were doing it more slowly, if they knew what to expect, if they said, okay, let's taper slowly off of this, let's expect a certain amount of discomfort, of some depression specifically, and let's just play that out and see if we can get back to a new baseline, and then decide if you want to keep taking this drug or not. That is not currently happening in this country. And this is how you get to 65 million Americans on one of these drugs, because it is very hard to come off.
That's wow. I'm kind of speechless. I really didn't realize it was that kind of numbers on very serious medications. Well, I hate to say, I guess we'll see what happens in Illinois, because I feel like it's going to be a disaster and a little bit like a slow moving train wreck to watch. But I actually do think it will be interesting to see the results. When you do something that drastic, I think it's important to be able to kind of see things almost in that kind of drastic, and be able to point to your politicians and be like, we need to change course here. I think this might be the thing that it's just so much of the thing that they've been doing and it hasn't been working, and it's such a large dose basically, that I think we're going to see, unfortunately, negative consequences, but it might be something that we can point to in other states and say, look, this isn't working. We need a different avenue. So I thank you so much for coming on. I want you to tell people how they can find your work, your organization.
Sure. Yeah. Come see us. We're at www.theinnercompass.org. If you Google Inner Compass Initiative and psychiatric drugs, you'll also find us that way. Sometimes people can't remember the URL. We offer a whole lot of stuff. Lots of families, lots of prescribers also use our resources. So we're not just for patients and their families.
That's great.
We have a ton of resources available for free. That's what our donors support us to do, is make this stuff available to everybody, because informed choice, people have a right. People should have a right to be fully informed and be able to make those choices. And we're getting better at it as a culture. I'm an optimist. I think that we're starting to wake up a little bit and think about this stuff differently. And credit to you, Melissa, for having me on, because even a few years ago, I wouldn't have likely heard from someone like you. So thank you for having me.
I don't think I would have had a platform myself just a few years ago, to be honest. No, I appreciate it. And, you're saying informed choice, and I don't think that a child alone in school without their parents there can make informed choices. That's another
Yeah.
concern that I have with all of this.
Yeah.
I like there to be resources outside the school where the parent has to take them, would be with
Mm-hmm.
them, so that decisions can be made with a adult who is responsible for that child, who can fully understand what's going on. Hopefully, if they're even, obviously
Mm-hmm.
there are other issues with that, but yeah. So that was just one last little thought I had on that. But folks could be coming to a school near you, a state near you. These are things to be watching out for. And you'd be surprised. It might not be as insane as, Illinois with universal
Mm-hmm.
yearly screenings, but these things are happening everywhere in some dose amount.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
It's
so
true.
much.
Thank you,
You have a
Melissa.
great
This is
day.
great. You
Yes.
too.
Okay.
All right.
Bye. That is it for the Liberty Lobbyist. I am Melissa Blasek, and you can find me at Melissa Blasek NH on Twitter, or at Rebuild NH. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can email me director@rebuildnh.com. Until next time.